So Waiterners, and welcome to a video on the first section of the prose literature for GCSE Latin. If you haven't watched any of these videos before, you will need to learn how the translation fits together and be able to analyse what the author is writing in terms of their style. Remember, you are analysing Latin, not the English translation. The first 5 sections are all written by Julius Caesar, probably the most famous Roman of all time. In this particular instance, he's writing about his conquests during the Gallic Wars, i.e. modern-day France. It's worth noting that these were written in the third person and were designed to be read out in Rome. He needs to remind people of his existence and how awesome he is, otherwise they might forget him, which would be terrible for his political ambitions. We're very much starting in medias res. In 54 BC, the Eburones, one of the Belgic tribes previously conquered by Caesar, has rebelled, and they are now besieging the camp of Quintus Tullius Cicero, the younger brother of the famous politician. He's going to come up again in sections 9 and 10. Quintus is in a pretty bad position, and Caesar is describing the fairly heroic events of 2 of his centurions. So, the first chunk. These are fairly artificially divided up, by the way, just so that they'll fit onto slides nicely. Erant in ea legione. There were, in that legion, fortissimi viri, very brave men. Remember, Caesar is describing the heroic actions of his own men, so he is going to hype them up a little bit, because that emphasizes how good a leader he is. Anyway, centurions, qui appropinquarent, who were approaching the primis ordinibus, the first ranks, i.e. the senior ranks of the centurions. Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. These technically masculine plural things, so men, habebant, used to have or were having, perpetuas controversias, continual disputes inter se between themselves, quinam anteferatur, as to who should be preferred, in the sense of who should be considered to be better, or potentially promoted first. And in omnibus annis, in all their years, they were contendebating, de locis, about their positions, with summis simultantibus, with utmost rivalry. So, brief bit of background. Centurions were a really important part of Roman military success. Unlike the higher level officers, who usually came from noble-ish families, centurions were actually promoted from the ranks, usually for bravery in battle. They also had to be able to read and write, had to have letters of recommendation, be 30 years old, and have already fought for a while. There's a quote there that they are often chosen for their size, strength, and dexterity. They had to be strict and good at keeping up proper discipline. There's a notable story about one centurion whose nickname was Bring Me Another, because he kept on breaking sticks, hitting his own soldiers if they weren't marching properly. The most senior centurion in each cohort commanded it, and the most senior of all the centurions was Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect. Titus and Pullo are therefore presumably more senior-ish centurions, and they're trying to get noticed by their commander so that they might get promoted. Ex his Pullo, out of these men Pullo, cum can mean with if it's in front of an ablative noun, but if it's got a subjunctive verb, it will mean when or since. So when, literally, it was being fought, acerrimi, very fiercely at the fortifications, but you might want to say when there was very fierce fighting. Quid dubitas inquit Vorene? Why are you hesitating? He said, Vorenus. Notice that I put said slightly earlier to make it a bit more sense in English. Out, or for quem locem, for what place, literally, I've translated as opportunity, of proving, tuae virtutis, your courage expectas, are you waiting for? Hic dies, this day, judicabit, will decide, de nostris controversiis, about our disputes. As a side note, you may have actually recognised those names Pullo and Vorenus, since they were main characters on HBO's Rome. If you haven't watched it, it's a really good series, slightly inaccurate in places, but really gets across the vibe of ancient Rome, although it is in a teens, so, you know, take that into account. Pullo, by the way, in here on the left was recast as a simple legionary, but in reality they were competing centurions. Ironically, Pullo actually survives the Gallic Wars and fights against Caesar later on, but here they are both centurions fighting for him. Cum dixisset, when he had said hike these things, he procedit extra, he advanced outside the munitiones, and erumpit, that pars of the enemy, hostium, which est visa seemed convertissima, most crowded. Remember, superlatives are often a nice thing to discuss in the style sense, because they are, by definition, quite emphatic words. Nay, nor, indeed, quidem, did Vorenus continet, hold or contain, sese, just another version of say, himself, then, technically wallow is in the wall, singular, but translated as plural, sed subsequitur, but followed, and then gives a little explanation here, veritus, having feared the existimationem, God, that's a hard word, fearing the opinion of all. Quick note that several times in here we have present tense verbs. These are all known as historic present. Caesar does this a lot to add a bit of vivid drama by making things in the present tense. With a mediocro spatio, with a moderate space or gap, relicto, technically having been left, this being an ablative absolute. Pullo imitit, sent or hurled his pilum in hostes, his javelin against the enemy or at the enemy, and tricit unum, pierced one, who was procurrentem, present participle, ex multitione. He pierced one running forwards from the crowd. Presumably there's a sort of milling throng outside the fortifications. Pullo's ran out and has immediately hurled his javelin at the first person to run up to him. Technically, with quo, him, with which person, i.e. the person from the previous sentence, percusso, struck, and exanimato, knocked unconscious, they protect. Note the bit in square brackets here is part of the translation, and when you are translating these lines, you should include it in the English, but I put it in square brackets because it doesn't actually correspond directly to anything in the Latin. Anyway, they protect hunc, this man, with their scutis, with their shields, and universi, altogether, universally, they coniciunt, they threw their tella, their missiles, in hostem, against their enemy. Notice the repetition. And they neque dant, they don't give him the facultatum, the opportunity, the availability of retreating. And that is it. That is the full part of section 1, describing the first bit of Pullo and Titus. God, mother